Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918 in a small South African village. His father, a tribal chief, gave his son the name Rolihlahla, which means troublemaker. At the age of 7, he began his British education, and his teacher gave him the name Nelson. When his father died, Nelson was sent to live with the leader of the Thembu people. He groomed Nelson for leadership, letting him sit in on council meetings, sending him to the finest schools. During a break from college, Nelson ran away to Johannesburg in order to avoid a prearranged marriage. It was 1941, and for the first time, Nelson came face to face with the brutal reality of a racially divided South Africa.
By entering the city as a kind of anonymous black person, he gets a first-hand experience of what black life is like for urban black South Africans at that time.
He began attending meetings of the African National Congress, an organization that aimed to establish a democratic government. It was in the spirit of these ideals that Nelson and the other younger, more militant members of the ANC formed a youth league within the organization to force a more radical approach. By the end of 1952, Mandela had become such a thorn in the government side that it decided he had to be silenced, and he was served with a banning order. This severely restricted his freedom of speech and movement. He could not attend public meetings or speak to more than one person at a time. Mandela now went underground. One day he was a very public figure. By the next, he had disappeared.
When Mandela went underground, of course, it added to the romantic image of the man. He became the heroic figure to the young black South Africans particularly. I mean, they were electrified by his name from that point onwards.
In July of 1962, Mandela slipped back into South Africa, but he was soon captured by the police. June 12, 1964, at the South African Supreme Court in Pretoria, Nelson Mandela, now 45 years old, was convicted with 7 others of conspiracy to overthrow the government. They were sentenced to life in prison, to be served at Robben Island, 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town. Then in 1976, everything changed when black student protesters were shot and killed by security forces in the black township of Soweto. Suddenly, the whole world took notice, and pressure on the government from inside and outside the country grew quickly. By the mid-1980s, the momentum for change was unstoppable. Nelson Mandela became a symbol for that change, and the call for his release became a rallying cry around the world. The moment had finally arrived, February 11, 1990. After nearly 30 years, Nelson Mandela, now 71 years old, was at last a free man. In Cape Town, more than 500,000 supporters, black, white, young, and old, packed the central square to hear him speak for the first time in nearly 3 decades.
Amandla! In Africa!
Mandela had been fighting the official racism of South Africa nearly his whole life, and he won from the government far more than anyone had ever expected it to concede. Just 3 months after his release, Mandela was chosen to lead the African National Congress in a historic first official meeting with the government. After 3 days, the two sides committed themselves to peaceful change. Witnesses might never have suspected how bitter these enemies had been.
I think he realized early on that in order to create a unified, non-racial South Africa, it had to be done in a way that was totally devoid of bitterness. He couldn't be seen to be bitter. He had to be bigger than it all.
His tremendous achievement was acclaimed by the world. In December of 1993, he won the Nobel Peace Prize together with South African President F.W. de Klerk. Nelson Mandela was now the ANC's candidate for president, and at the age of 75, he would lead his party in its first election campaign. On April 27, 1994, black South Africans in the millions cast their ballots. In some areas, voters stood in line in the hot sun for up to 3 days to exercise this extraordinary new right. To no one's surprise, the African National Congress emerged victorious, with Mandela at its helm. But in May of 1996, he and the entire country reached a milestone in their new era of freedom by adopting a new South African constitution.
We are one people with one destiny.
In February of 2010, Nelson Mandela joined friends and family to celebrate the 20th anniversary of his release from prison in 1990. He had spent 27 long years in jail, but once he became a free man, he wasted no time making up for lost years. During the 2 decades since his release, Mandela led South Africa as its first black president and tirelessly dedicated himself to the humanitarian causes he so strongly believed in. The amazing story of this principled man willing to suffer so much in the name of humanity not only changed his homeland, but touched the entire world.